We live in a moment right now where actually, they say the worst ideas in Washington are bipartisan. Our engagement in the Ukraine war continues to prove that, if you ask me. But the way we're going to actually do this is by transitioning from an era of neoconservatism and liberal hegemony to an era of realism and unapologetic American nationalism, where we stand for our national interests on the global stage. The North Star of my foreign policy will be the modern Monroe Doctrine, combined with Nixon's doctrine. The Nixon doctrine was that other nations have to be the first protectors of their own national security. I agree with that. We will revive that, and I combine that with the modern Monroe Doctrine, a doctrine that we will re-implement under my watch as U.S. President, which says that if you're a foreign nation, you do not mess with the United States of America on our own home soil. You do not test us on our waters or in the Western Hemisphere, and if you do, you will have hell to pay for it. No Chinese spy balloons flying over half the United States. No Chinese spy bases off the southeast coast of the United States. No Chinese manufactured fentanyl in the hands of Mexican drug cartels waging a modern opium war on the United States of America. But it also means that we will not fight somebody else's war if they're not actually defending their own territory either. The first accomplishment that I hope to deliver in my foreign policy agenda as U.S. President will therefore be to end the Ukraine war on terms that advance American interests. I refuse to use our own military resources to defend against an invasion across somebody else's border when we should be using our own military to defend against the invasion across our own southern border in this country, the United States of America. And in ending that war, I will borrow from none other than our main man tonight, Richard Nixon, who traveled in 1972 to China to pull a maneuver that only he could have pulled off. Nobody else other than Richard Nixon could have done it, because it was his own vision. You know, if you're going to actually find one of those rare moments to reassert American interests on the global stage, you can't be just a vehicle for somebody else's agenda. In fact, much of the managerial class underneath him resisted the decision that he made, because they said, you can't trust Mao Zedong. Well, Richard Nixon knew we couldn't trust Mao Zedong, but he knew we could trust Mao to follow his self-interest if Mao could trust us to follow ours. And that's what he did. He did it out of strategic necessity. Yes, other presidents thereafter, in the decades that came after, messed that up with the doctrine of democratic capitalism that then took that to the next level, thinking that we were going to export Big Macs and Happy Meals, and somehow that was going to spread democracy to places like China. That didn't work. That was a bipartisan consensus through the 1990s, but that wasn't Nixon's vision. Nixon's vision was to recognize that the chief threat that the United States faced, the Cold War that we were actually in, was not with Red China, but was with the USSR. And he recognized that Mao was in a strategic relationship with Brezhnev, with the USSR at the time, that posed together an alliance that truly threatened American interests on the global stage. And so he did what he needed to do. He traveled to China to pull Mao Zedong out of that alliance with Brezhnev. And that was the beginning of our path that allowed Reagan to be on the strong footing to bring us to the near end of the Cold War itself. Well, I have a news flash for the modern neoconservative establishment, the modern propagators of liberal hegemony. The good news is that the USSR does not exist anymore. An alliance, NATO, that we formed to deter the spread of the USSR, to deter the possibility of nuclear war with the USSR, that alliance has now expanded more after the fall of the USSR than it ever did during the existence of the USSR. The real threat we face today, the equivalent of the USSR that Nixon faced, is actually communist China today. We have to open our eyes to the fact that we're not in the 1970s anymore. We live in the year 2023, and we must awaken to the real threats that we face. Now it's an enemy who we depend on for our modern way of life. And today, once again, how history comes full circle, the Russia-China alliance represents the single greatest military threat that we face in the U.S. today. Russia's hypersonic missile capabilities and nuclear capabilities outstripping that of the United States, combined with China's naval capacity in the South China Sea that outstrips that of the United States, combined with being an economy that we depend on for the shoes on our feet or the phones in our pockets, that Russia-China military alliance is the single greatest threat we face. Nobody in either political party is talking about it, and that is why I will end the Ukraine war on terms that require Vladimir Putin to exit his military alliance with China. This is a reverse move of what Nixon did. Putin is the new Mao. And while we have a foreign policy establishment in both parties, including Biden, who tries to supplicate to China to get Xi Jinping to drop Vladimir Putin, what we really need to be doing is getting Vladimir Putin to drop Xi Jinping. And so what I've said is that, you know what, in any good deal, I know this from the business world, it's not that different in foreign policy. Everybody has to get something out of the deal. That is realism. That is the truth of how a good deal gets done. The deal I will do with Vladimir Putin is simple. We will freeze the current lines of control. We will further make a hard commitment that NATO will never admit Ukraine to NATO. But in return for that, that's a big win for Putin. I'll admit that. You're not supposed to say you give Putin big wins. That's a big win for Putin. But there's a bigger win for us. The bigger win for us is I will require that Russia exit its military alliance with China. I will require that Russia remove its nuclear weapons from Kaliningrad, the strip of Russia that borders Poland. And I will require, pursuant to my modern Monroe Doctrine, that Russia remove its military presence in the Western Hemisphere, not in Cuba, not in Venezuela, not in Nicaragua. You're out. And in return, we will reopen economic relations with Russia, just as Nixon did with China, to recognize that, do we trust Vladimir Putin? No, we don't. Does Putin trust us? No, he does not. But Putin can trust us to follow our self-interest, just as we can trust Putin to follow his. And that is why in my first year in office, in 2025, I will make a trip to Moscow to deliver the same deal that Nixon did when he traveled to China. This is how we restore realism in our modern foreign policy, to actually advance American interests by pulling apart the alliances that threaten us. Now, the conventional wisdom is that this will threaten Taiwan and threaten American interests, which we have in Taiwan, because that will embolden Xi Jinping to go after that island nation. The argument goes that if Putin walks away with parts of the Donbas region, that will somehow cause Xi Jinping to be emboldened to think he can walk away with impunity if he takes a piece of Taiwan. I think it's actually the reverse that's true. Today, we are driving Russia further into China's hands. And Xi Jinping's calculus is that the U.S. will not want to go into conflict with two different allied nuclear superpowers, Russia and China, at the same time. But if Russia is no longer in China's camp, is no longer a 2001 treaty ally, as they are today, then Xi Jinping will have to think twice before going after Taiwan. It's the number one thing we can actually do to deter Xi Jinping from going after Taiwan while avoiding war, is pull Russia apart from China. Combined with that, a renewed commitment to our partnership that we may expand with India. Hard commitments to close the Andaman Sea and block the Malacca Strait if required, in the position of potential conflict arising around Taiwan. India would happily do that if we gave them a trade deal that looked similar to what we have already with Chile or Australia. And I'm not just saying that because my name is Vivek freaking Ramaswamy here, okay? In fact, part of the reason that we have a relationship of mistrust, I would say a relationship of trust with India that could leave room for improvement, is that we haven't had the kind of trust-based dialogue between our two countries. And so, you know what, if I'm not going to get that done by the end of my first term, I would consider that a personal failure on an ethnic count. But this is how we think about deterrence of China. Bolster our relationship with allies who share our interest in deterring Taiwan while pulling Russia out of China's hands. I'm a big believer in the Second Amendment here at home. Let's turn our Second Amendment into an export. That's what American exceptionalism is about. Leave it to Taiwan to adopt a Second Amendment of its own. Put a gun in every Taiwanese household. Train them how to use it. That's how you turn Taiwan into a porcupine. This is how you deter China. But why is it in our interest then to deter China from going after Taiwan if we're not doing the same with respect to Russia and Ukraine? The answer is it comes back down to American self-interest. Taiwan is responsible for the leading-edge semiconductors that power our modern, technologically facilitated lifestyle. Probably these lights that are shining in my face, the phones in our pockets, the computers that we type up our notes on, those cameras that are recording me in the back. These are powered by leading-edge semiconductors that come from this tiny island nation off the southeast coast of China. I think it's regrettable that we got to a place where our modern way of life depends on that island nation, but that remains a fact. Which is why I've said that we will move from our, I believe, inexplicable posture of strategic ambiguity with respect to Taiwan in my first year to a position of strategic clarity, where I will be clear with China and with Taiwan that we will defend Taiwan if China invades Taiwan before we have semiconductor independence in this country. I will lead us, I hope by the end of my first term, to semiconductor independence in this country. By 2028, I believe it is possible in the United States of America. And thereafter, we will be very clear that after the U.S. achieves semiconductor independence, our commitments to send our sons and daughters to put them in harm's way will change after we've achieved semiconductor independence. These are naked views that you're not supposed to share in public. Right? These are the things you're supposed to keep in a hush-hush format, sweep under the rug, to know that you kind of mean these things, but you don't actually say them. I actually believe it is in our interest to unapologetically state to the world what I will state to you all at home, that it is my moral obligation as the next U.S. president to stand for the interests of Americans here in the homeland without apologizing for it. When I tell the rest of the global leaders that I mean it, they will know they can trust us. And it's not really credible to say that we're going to defend democracy selectively when the democracy of the day we're defending is a nation that has banned 11 opposition parties, goes after religious minorities and churches, and has consolidated all media into one state media arm. That's Ukraine, if you weren't wondering. It doesn't make sense, right? But if we say that, no, we're going to be very honest. Our engagement outside the Western Hemisphere will be limited to the circumstances where it actually advances U.S. interests. Then that puts Taiwan on notice that a nation that's supposedly at threat of annexation is now spending less than 2% of its GDP on its military. It better step that up to 4% by 2028, which is where it'll need to be to have a chance of defending itself. It'll put China on notice to say that, you know what, you have some nationalistic unfinished business from 1949 when Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek had at it. But you will not mess with the United States and our interests by holding an economic gun to our head, by taking a shot for going after that island, until we have semiconductor independence in this country. This is how we smoke out realism, revive Nixonian realism in the modern day. Revive George Washington's vision of what it means to put the interests of this nation first. This is an uncomfortable shock to the modern bipartisan foreign policy establishment. I'm an outsider. That is what I believe it will take to turn our foreign policy establishment back upside down where it belongs. That is what it will take to get our NATO allies who spend, more than half of whom less than the 2% they're obligated by treaty to actually spend on their own national defense. That is how we restore sanity to a world in which we represent 36% of our allied GDP while spending 61% of our allied defense. This is not the stuff of advancing American interests, but it will take an outsider with a fresh perspective to actually restore American interests in our own foreign policy. What I will say in closing before opening this up to a few questions tonight is that I reject the other bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. It's the flip side of the same one that has us continuing to send $200 billion to a nation around the other side of the world that we have no interest in. The flip side of that is an assumption embedded in there that Republicans and Democrats alike will agree to today. The assumption that we are a nation in decline. The assumption that we're at the tail end of the Roman Empire and that we have to puff our chest to project a self-confidence that does not exactly exist here at home. I don't believe we have to be like ancient Rome. I don't believe that we have to be a nation in decline. The truth is, I think what we really are is a nation that's just a little young, going through our own version of adolescence, figuring out who we're really going to be when we grow up. And when you view it that way, it makes sense. When you go through adolescence, you go through that national identity crisis. You go through that identity crisis of self. I did. Maybe many of you did. You lose your self-confidence. You lose your way a little bit. You forget who you really are. But we are stronger for it when we reach our adulthood on the other side. So you know what I say? We are not a nation in decline. I believe we can still be a nation in our ascent. Maybe in the early stages of our ascent. Maybe we're not even at base camp yet, on our way to that mountaintop, still that shining city on a hill, where no matter who you are, where your parents came from, what your skin color is, how long your last name is, that you still get ahead in this country based on your own hard work, your own commitment, your own dedication, and that you know what, you are still free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream. That is what we are running to. That is how we revive our strength at home so that we may set an example of what is possible for the rest of the free world. That is our obligation to the world, to be strong at home. That is what I will revive as your next president. Thank you all. God bless you. God bless your family.